people's choice in matters of belief begin with intellectual, aesthetic, and moral. You can kind of see how he defines those. What do you think about him and his view of the choice of belief and the faculties of perception? How do you engage with that? What do you think?
About the
intellectual, aesthetic, and moral. Do you think that kind of hits on some important parts of belief in your viewpoint? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think when people are really, I'm not just looking at belief for the sake of like what therapeutic sort of belief, but the belief where they're trying to actually explore their own spirituality. Actually, I really thought a lot about the intellectual and moral part. Sort of the aesthetic. I label that identification is something I've just heard only from him, and like this idea that sort of belief has to hit you in a certain way, has to strike you in a certain way, that it's not only about how you think about it and how you feel about it in a moral sense, but also just sort of like the beauty of spirituality, the beauty of belief. I think that's also important, because then how else are you going to be attracted to belief? Yeah, I think that like those three labels, those three distinctions make a lot of sense to me.
Now go into how New Begin begins with the nature of God as a God of action and purpose, as opposed to the timeless, absolute Hindu thought impression of God as kind of something completely other and outside of time. What does that make you think? How does that strike you? What do you think about New Begin starting there?
You know, how a lot of Hindus will meditate, will pray and have these rituals to sort of bring that sort of other divine energy into our lives. It makes me think about how sort of the world is, because there's something above us, right? There's something higher. The world is more structured. There is sort of like expectations and standards to live a certain way, take care of community and family a certain way, certain responsibilities that are there just because of who you are. If you're talking now, when I talk about a God of action and purpose, I think about it more like a progressive God, a God that's trying to, a God with an agenda, so to speak, sort of trying to implement changes a certain way, which doesn't necessarily sit well with me, because, I mean, then this idea comes up that well, if the God has purpose, where is like the result sort of question, and it's also that, I mean, on the surface, it sounds really easy to. It sounds like you're getting more engaged with a God of action and purpose, right? You can sort of build a relationship, but it's also like sort of the human condition, the way people view themselves, the way people view their communities, the way people act on their own interests. Sort of the way I see it, that's always been there, no matter what technology, what science, what civilization, what religion. That's always been there for thousands of years ago, and will be there for thousands of years. Sort of like that's like a sort of continuity of humanity. In that case, where is the agenda of God? And that's sort of like what I'm thinking.
So what do you think about New Begin starting with the character of Jesus being this kind of paradox? What do you think about that?
So when I'm thinking about what we went through with John, I was sort of, I remember I kept asking you questions about, well, Jesus is saying one thing but doing another. It sounds like he's both a prophet and a God simultaneously. You know, it sounds like, you know, he can do miracles, but his miracles sometimes seem pointless. You know, or you know, he's that. You know, or at least it's not like achieving that end that he wants to achieve with the Israelites, and so like that was my that question kept coming up, and you just said, you know, wait, we'll see. And so sort of like as John is wrapping up, the paradoxes start to make a little bit more sense. The fact that that New Begin would start by outlining sort of like these paradoxes, the questionable aspects of Jesus' story, sort of, I think that brings some authenticity to the teaching, like, that makes it clear that, there is more depth here than just Jesus died for you, Jesus is there to save you. There's more depth in that. And so that's sort of like sort of hinting at there's more to learn, more to think about, and if you have questions as it comes up, as you study more and more, you can sort of remember those, sort of like compare one side of the paradox to the other, as you go along.
Thank you for that. I actually think starting with this paradox is extremely important, because when we look at each other, I think this is a good testimony and an anthropological statement, of which we've talked about a little bit, but the nature of mankind is both and. It's both, we are good and we are bad. We are capable of both, but that God is both love and judgment, both severe and tender. It helps me identify with him a little bit, to some extent, not in the same way that he was both good and evil, but that he is both completely loving and completely just, that he is both authority and humility. What it sounds like is it takes you deeper into the story versus it just being a one frequency, he's good, believe him, sort of thing.
Right.
I like the idea of front-loading the, what do we call it?
The character of Jesus, the paradox.
The paradox, thank you, as a walking paradox. However it is, I think, to continue to beckon people deeper with curiosity and question, as opposed to strong statements of what is the case. I like the fact that paradox almost whets the appetite. So those are two takeaways for me from what I hear, what he's doing, that would I think strengthen the way that I've been sharing my faith.
So Harsha, now we're moving into looking at the New Testament testimony about Jesus' death. And New Begin is going to focus on three parts of his death. He's going to focus on Jesus' death as judgment, Jesus' death as judgment on the world, Jesus' death as love, divine love in action, and then third, Jesus' death as demanding of decision. Death demands decision. How does that strike you? What do you think?
By Jesus' death is presented as a judgment on our world. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, let me read this quote maybe too. Would it be helpful if we looked at the quote again?
Yeah.
So when perfect love appeared, which is Jesus, men had to hound it to death, says New Begin.
Okay.
For in our world there was no room for such a man, who upset everything, claimed everything, and yet a king who yet refused kingship in the only way in which men understood it. We could not bear to be in the presence of such a loving person. That he wasn't just good, but he was so loving that it convicted us, and that we didn't want that type of power. We don't want to be that type of love. We thought of as dangerous,
right?
So we wanted to kill it, because it threatened us. It threatened to show us as our fraudulent, viceful, evil intent in with how we hold power. So I think your question's good.
Yeah, I mean, so when you talk about the death of Jesus, I know like we've discussed this before. It's something like I still struggle to comprehend with. Like sort of this idea of why would anyone want to die? Why would somebody voluntarily die? Sort of like that makes it the fact that that's like paradoxical, right? Like that someone who like has it all, Jesus, right, would willingly die. That's something I'm still trying to understand. So to move on from there, we talk about the death of Jesus is God's love in action. That's something I have a little bit of difficulty accepting, just because if sure I see Jesus as a righteous man, a moral man, but then if Jesus is the Son of God, why would God kill his son, right? When I think of, we were speaking earlier about Jesus as sort of like another incarnation of God. All the stories that I'll talk about these incarnations of God, all these avatars, right? They're either about taking out evil that is there, or they're about helping the people that can't help themselves, like helping the poor, helping the disabled, or helping the people, the community, right? Dying isn't a help. You don't get anything when you die. That's not practical, right? That's That's not a practical Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
The practical Son of God is the prophet who's going everywhere and spreading the message and telling people there's more out there. There's more spirituality you can find to make yourself a better person. You know, that's the practical, right? The death of Jesus is God's love in action. It doesn't make sense to me. I mean.
And so I love that New Begin is just pressing on and pushing towards, are we seeing Jesus clearly? One question that's arising for me as you're presenting the questions, I'm looking at some of the material, is if we don't have a clear anthropology of the plight of humanity, you know, I think seeing God's character, seeing man's plight, and what Jesus accomplished are all really necessary to experience and taste the depth and the beauty of the gospel. And so it's almost as if a focus on who Jesus is and what he's accomplished needs the backdrop of who I really am. And if I haven't helped people put words to that and express that, I could be missing the target because we're not operating from the same understanding of who humanity is and what their needs are. So that's one question I'd ask about those early sessions. If we're not assuming that there's actually a problem to be addressed, can the fullness and the beauty of Jesus really be understood?
That's what I'm struggling with.
And I think that's completely valid. What do you think about him saying that when you grasp those two concepts, once you get there and get into that next part, what shall we do? What do you think about the call to response?
Now that last part makes a lot of sense to me. Death is a big motivator for us. If you think about political actions, military actions, sort of like when there is suffering and poverty, people really want to move to do things. But when there's death, people feel very concerned because people value life,
right.
They value experiencing their life and making things better. And so when someone dies for you, you now feel like I think we talked about this the other day. Like if your friend dies for you, well, yeah, I'm definitely gonna want to do things to make sure my friend didn't die in vain. Yeah.
So now that we've talked about Jesus' death, New Begin then focuses 3 lessons on the New Testament testimony about the resurrection. New Begin says this about the resurrection. He says, everything said about the cross is said because the resurrection followed it. And so he sees the resurrection as the vindication of Jesus and his authority. He sees it as the means by which we have a new friendship with Jesus and God. And then it proves that God has power beyond death and over death to bring life out of defeat and corruption. So what do you think about spending 3 sessions zooming in on those 3 ideas? How does that strike you? What do you think about that?
So first, like about the vindication of Jesus, right? That makes sense, right? If you're the one claiming that, you can bring more happiness, you can bring better life to people, you can bring a better interpretation of how to live, and that you have this divine authority, that you would come back to life, so that it would be possible to sort of like there are so many people around you that want you gone, and then killed him on the cross, then he comes back. That does show sort of like an authority beyond just sort of like simple human decisions, right? Like
he wasn't just a good guy who was able to make wise decisions. He
had like sort of like divine power, so to speak. And then finally, when you're talking about it proves like the writ of God, like the power of God beyond death. That's actually the most interesting part, because sort of death is sort of like this dirty, evil thing, right? Like at least we want.
It's a violent thing, at least.
It's violent. It's I had the unfortunate, watched my uncle die of cancer, and so as was like the cancer is growing, and he's like his body is totally like failing, and he's just blabbering and speaking crazy things like sort of over the course of a week, and then he passed away. I would never want to see that again. And so it's like if God can sort of reverse that, I don't know if it's good or bad or right or wrong, but it shows an interesting power. And something that really makes me curious is you were just talking to me about, we knew his tomb was empty. Like, I want to know, like, what time did Jesus die? When did they put him in? When did he come out? Like, what's the evidence? I want to see it. And if he really did come back to life, then that is something that is really interesting. And so to finally answer your question about, what do I think about having three sessions focused on him coming back to life, his resurrection? I think it's an important focus, especially when you consider that if he dies and he can then reverse that, then there is something unique, special, divine about him, about Jesus. But then also that's some credibility. That is you're saying that the goodness you can bring can counteract death, right? Something like that is the opposite of life, right? Then that makes me think that there is actually maybe something of substance in what he is trying to teach and spread. I mean, as you can tell from my responses, I'm still trying to
you're still
understand. Yeah, I'm still trying to understand this. But when you speak about the resurrection this way, it does in fact make Jesus look more like a unique character, more directly answering the human concern of what do I do with my life,
right?
Like, how do I live my life,
right?
How do I respond to death?
Newbigin would leave his Indian students with the Lord. Jesus was the Lord and Christ. Does it make a difference whether we regard Jesus as an incarnation of God or as the incarnation of God? Imagine that you've kind of gone through these sessions already and you come to this point. How does this differ from the other incarnations? And you kind of talked about it before, the avatars. At this point, having gone through all these things and having made a conclusion about those things as worthy of belief or worthy of consideration, engage with that question that Newbigin would leave with Indian students.
Sort of all the incarnations of God that I'm taught in, when I went to sort of like the Hindu Sunday school when I was a kid, the stories were all about sort of there's some wrongdoings happening in the world, and so God will take maybe this form of this mythical animal, or he'll come back as a king or a priest or something, and that incarnation of God will do what needs to be done to sort of set order again, right? Sort of like there's going to be and then set the order again, and things will go on as it will, and then something bad will happen again, and then come back, set the order again.
So it's the cycle, that same cycle.
Yeah, cyclical sort of like stories, right? Like I've told you this before, like when you talk about Jesus Christ, it reminds me a lot about Sai Baba. Sai Baba, right? Who a lot of people, nobody knows where he came from. Nobody knows how he died or where he went. We know where he died, but nobody knows where he comes from. He was able to like magically. This was in the 1800s, not too long ago in British India, right? And so he was able to come up with food and water for the poor Muslim and Hindu people, and he was able to bring peace between Muslims and Hindus and British people who are trying to divide them. And so people will pray and have rituals to Sai Baba because they see him as such a almost divine figure. There's temples all around India for Baba, right? So like a lot of people regard him as the incarnation of God. But then, so when you think, does it make a difference? Does it matter whether Jesus is the incarnation or a incarnation? At first, no, I don't think it matters. That's my first response. But then, so you ask me sort of like, think about it, you went through all these lessons and now you're here. Well, the last thing we talked about was his resurrection. None of these stories talk about that. All of these stories about the incarnation of God are about divine miracles. And these divine miracles are helpful to the society around them, but they're all divine. The way we talked about Jesus was very down to earth. And then the resurrection is like, so everything up to his death was like, he's just a plain human being. And then once he gets to the resurrection, then he's divine.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Sort of like Jesus has both godly and humanly sort of characteristics to him. But then again, does it matter if he's an incarnation of God? I don't know. But I think the resurrection and his death and the circumstances around that make him more of a unique figure than what I've learned about before, as far as sort of the Hindu mythology is concerned. I'm sorry, I'm not able to give you a super solid answer, but it makes Jesus a bit more unique.
And now, after we talked about the resurrection and the uniqueness of Jesus as the incarnation versus an incarnation, we're now going to look at the powers that follow belief. Here are the marks of the power that when you do make a decision, a choice to believe and respond to God's calling on your life, you are given more power. You are given power in a sense. Power, the freedom to give of yourself freely as you've been given, Jesus freely. The freedom, this quote here, the gratitude from the cross produces fruits far finer than fear could ever do. So it just slaps in Machiavelli's face. This gratitude produces a greater fruit than the fear. He even says that as the gospel is rediscovered, the same new power to transform men and societies to produce practical results in the personal goodness, social justice, and all kinds of adventurous energy for the sake of God's kingdom will be witnessed. And then the last lesson is how this new power creates a fellowship of the Holy Spirit in the church, whose lifeblood is to learn to love like Jesus. So those are the 3 lessons about the powers that follow. What do you think about New Begin ending with this? What are your thoughts? How does that strike you?
So to clarify, essentially the comments here by New Begin are that when you choose to respond to the call, when you choose to build a relationship with God, Jesus, community, that's when sort of you experience the joy Jesus is discussing.
The power is correct.
This actually sounds like whenever we've discussed, I've had a lot of doubts about what you put forward. But the thing I doubt the least, and the thing that sounds the most alluring, is what you're talking about right here. Sort of when you not building a relationship, but the nature of the relationship you build, and it's like they talked about in service today. God is all loving, unconditional sort of acceptance.
Even if, right?
Even if you do X, Y, Z, still accepting, still loving, and then so it's sort of like when you're around really close friends and you feel like no one's judging you, no one's saying anything, you feel super comfortable, you feel like you can do whatever you want and anything will be okay. And that's sort of this adventurous spirit you're talking about. And that's what I can relate to most when we were discussing or during the Bible study for the past few months, is that, so you're telling me that God can be an equivalent friend, maybe even a better friend, that you're telling me that I can sort of feel comfortable all the time, and I can feel like this sort of energy where, well, there's so many things to do, I can go do them all, and I can go help people along the way. Sort of that is the most human part of all this. Out of everything we've talked about, forget death, resurrection, incarnation, what feels the most human is talking about relationship. And then sort of, I know you want to tie this back to my background, and it's like I've said this before, that what I see in all my extended family is sort of this sort of the only thing they ever think about is sort of helping family and community, the relationship. I haven't necessarily experienced that personally all the time. I do have my own sort of struggle with building good relationships. But then you say this relationship with God can help you experience more freedom. I mean, that sounds like the most easily relatable aspect of all this, of Jesus' message, but also the thing that on a selfish level that I would want. Yeah.
And what this new power gives you is actually the freedom to give yourself away, to not guard your life and hoard it like a poor man who is afraid, but to live with the freedom, the adventurous energy, personal goodness, social justice, to transform men and societies. And even in many of our conversations about government, your role, your view of government you've understood that as the means by which societies and are transformed and improved. And I would say yes, both and with the people, the citizens, who are also doing it even above and beyond their taxes, even above and beyond their lives. And that those, as many of the abuses, there are so many breakthroughs that happen when we go on this kind of adventurous energy for the sake of God's kingdom, not as oppression and membership, but as liberation and vindication of people's humanity, of people's dignity. That's the pursuit of Christians, to let people know that they are dignified, that they are fully dignified by a God who loved them so much,
right,
that he was willing to be undignified to dignify them.
As in, like, he was willing to come down
Correct. To condescend himself,
right,
to not only condescend himself, but to die, and then to show that he can, in the miry pit, come out of it. That's the hope, and that energy, that power, through the Spirit of God, lives in you when you become a believer. Not in equal measure at all times, but in maturation, you begin to experience.
Yeah, sort of like a final thought. It's like, sort of thinking about this relationship sort of gives the idea of God purpose to your own life.
Correct.
Because then it becomes less about it's something above me, as more something and it becomes something I engage with, or someone I engage with. And I think maybe in the future that would actually be an interesting lens to look through the death and the resurrection of Jesus, through the lens of how does this affect our relationship.
And the power. Well, thank you, Harsha. This has been great.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
It's fun.